While the world feared a Soviet strike, a network of civilian sleeper agents was already being secretly assembled in snowy Alaska. People who, in the event of an invasion, were to become the last line of defense for the USA. June 1950. Washington is suffocating from summer humidity. That special, sticky humidity that makes collars soak and papers turn yellow right on the desk. In the closed offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, phones are ringing, one after another, persistently. North Korean troops have crossed the 38th parallel. The world is splitting apart again. But for some American officials, the news about Korea is not just a regional conflict on the other side of the earth. It is a signal, possibly a diversionary maneuver before the real strike. And the real strike, according to their calculations, could come from a completely different direction. A year earlier, in the summer of 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The American monopoly on nuclear weapons, that on which all post-war confidence in one's own invulnerability rested, suddenly ceased to exist. The USA and Western Europe created NATO. Mao's revolutionaries proclaimed victory in China. Communism was moving, expanding, filling space, and the American fear of this movement was not abstract, but physically tangible, like a soaked-through tunic that no longer provides warmth. When, in June 1950, North Korea, with Soviet support, threw troops to the south, a number of American analysts immediately assumed the worst. Korea was a diversionary maneuver. The real goal was Western Europe, and possibly something closer to home. Military strategists looked at the map and saw what had long caused alarm: a huge, poorly defended, strategically vital protrusion of American territory, separated from the Soviet Far East only by a narrow strip of icy water. Alaska. Imagine a staff officer standing before a map of the Northern Hemisphere in the early 50s. He sees the arc of the Aleutian Islands, curving directly toward Kamchatka. He sees the Bering Strait, 80 kilometers between two continents. He sees Fairbanks, Anchorage, Nome, cities that, under conditions of rapid airstrike, are impossible to defend fully. The territory is too vast to fortify militarily, yet too important to leave undefended. This paradox gave birth to Operation Washtub. The historical precedent for such fears was quite real. In World War II, Imperial Japan briefly occupied the uninhabited Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska, precisely to distract American forces from the central part of the Pacific Ocean. The maneuver worked. The American army threw significant resources into recapturing two scraps of frozen land that represented no strategic value in themselves. Soviet military thought could not fail to take this lesson into account, and American military thought could not either. In 1951, a former U.S. Army intelligence officer wrote a warning to the CIA. His name was Reserve Major Arthur Carpenter. During the years of World War II, he was the Director of Security and Intelligence in Whitehorse, Canada, and knew this region perfectly: its people, its geography, its weak points. In the letter, he warned of the potential for a popular uprising in Alaska and the Yukon in the event of a Soviet invasion. He described the only shared land border between the USA and the USSR. He listed possible targets for attacks by communist partisans, highways, airports, and he specifically pointed to a large number of socialists and communists living in the region. The letter was made public by the government transparency site Muckrock 70 years later as documentary evidence of how seriously the threat was taken by those familiar with the real state of affairs in the North. American strategists took into account another fact. Russia was a colony on this territory in the 18th century, up until the sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867 for $7,200,000. The territory remembered the Russians, and some analysts allowed that the Russians remembered the territory. In military memorandums, the scenario was spelled out with bureaucratic clarity. The military believes it will be an aerial invasion, with bombing and paratrooper landings. The most likely targets were considered to be Nome, Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Seward. Cities that today are known to tourists and lovers of the Northern Lights were in those years viewed as potential bridgeheads for a Soviet occupation. It was against this background, of atomic fear, the Korean shock, and Arctic vulnerability that in early 1951, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover entered into a partnership with Joseph Carroll, his former protege who headed the newly created U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Together, they launched what subsequently became known by several names simultaneously, depending on who was speaking and in which office. Here it is important to stop and understand one detail, without which the entire subsequent story looks confusing. The FBI called its part of the program STAGE, Stay Behind Agent Program. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations called it Operation Washtub. Together, both parts became known as the Alaska Project. Inside the government, the program also circulated under the code names Corpuscle, Stigmatic, and Catboat. The official history of OSI would subsequently call it one of the most extensive and long-running projects of the Cold War. The same classified case lived under different names not because someone got confused in the papers. This was a deliberate architecture of secrecy. The more names, the harder it is to assemble the overall picture, even for those who had access to part of the documents.
The operation ran from 1951 to 1959, up to the moment when Alaska received statehood status and the entire structure formally lost its legal sense. The declassified archive totals 3,271 pages, 2,126 from the FBI and 1,145 from the Air Force, dated from 1950 to 1959. In 2014, the Air Force declassified 704 documents about the operation. Heavily redacted FBI records were handed over to Associated Press journalists via the site Government Attic, which publishes documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. Many pages at that point looked as if they had been processed with scissors. Black rectangles of censorship sometimes occupied the greater part of a paragraph. What exactly stood behind all these code names and thick folders with security classifications? The answer was formulated in planning documents with that business-like conciseness characteristic of intelligence bureaucracies. The plan provides for the creation of an organization in Alaska designed to obtain, collect, and transmit intelligence data that may be useful to the U.S. in the event of an invasion and occupation of Alaska or part of it by enemy armed forces.
If the clerical language is removed, the simple essence remains. American Special Services wanted to pre-position people on Alaskan territory who, in the event of a Soviet occupation, would remain in place and continue working, quietly, unnoticeably, under the guise of ordinary residents. The operation had two phases, and both existed in parallel. The first, and more urgent, was the Resident Agent Program. This concerned the formation of sleeper agents right among the civilian population, people who, in the event of an invasion, would not evacuate, but would remain and continue gathering information. The second phase was structured differently. In parallel, a reserve pool of civilian operatives was being created, trained to secretly organize the evacuation of downed military crews who faced Soviet captivity. This evasion and escape plan was coordinated with the CIA, which is particularly noteworthy against the background of another decision discussed below. The first task involved something that in other times would have been called a partisan movement. The plan consisted of creating volunteer forces from civilian hunters, people accustomed to living in the wild, and bush pilots, those who knew this land better than any soldier sent from the continent. They were to become anti-Soviet partisans, acting with the support of caches of weapons, ammunition, and gold.
The forces were intended to be supplemented by a pool of agents who, if necessary, would be dropped into Alaska by parachute from the outside. The entire program was built on the model of American and British programs for supporting partisans in occupied Europe during World War II, with the difference that instead of French or Norwegian underground fighters, there were American loggers, hunters, and those who knew how to survive in Arctic winter conditions. Planners understood perfectly what they would have to deal with. Soviet military doctrine provided for the elimination of local resistance in occupied territory. The Air Force did not expect that all or even most of their sleeper agents would survive. In connection with the recognized policy that the Soviets applied to destroy the population of occupied territories, the plan required saturation with agents, placing them in such quantity that even after significant losses, part of the network would be preserved.
To compensate for expected losses, a reserve pool of agents was to be located outside Alaska and subsequently dropped in by air. This was a task that federal officials recognized as extremely dangerous, among themselves, but not in front of the new agents. Who exactly were they looking for this deadly and completely secret work? The answer is surprising in its pragmatism. Not soldiers, not intelligence officers with professional training.
The selection criteria were formulated with deliberate specificity. Agents should be permanent residents of Alaska, with established sources of income and justifiable reasons for being in the locations where they intend to operate. They should not be military personnel or government employees. They should be selected from among those who are not likely objects of internment. The program should not have any visible connections with the Army or intelligence service. In practice, this meant fishermen, bush pilots, hunters, trappers, owners of small hotels, postmasters, miners, people whose presence in the most remote corners of Alaska would not seem suspicious to anyone because they live there, work there, and are not going anywhere. From Alaska's population of approximately 135,000 people, the initial list of potential agents numbered 40,000. It was reduced to 89 potential resident agents, those who passed preliminary screening and could be considered for recruitment. In October 1950, Hoover proposed a ratio of approximately 1 agent per 1,000 residents, about 130 agents across the entire territory. To obtain the first candidates, the Anchorage office of the FBI turned to several of its most trusted contacts with a request for recommendations, but without disclosing any aspects of Operation Washtub. Among them were Benjamin Stewart of Valdez, Judge Anthony Diamond of Anchorage, Judge George Folta of Juneau, Judge Harry Pratt of Fairbanks, U.S. Attorney J. Earl Cooper of Anchorage, and Dr. Howard Romick of Anchorage. People with reputations and connections. It was they who could point to those who could be trusted without explaining why. American intelligence, despite all the rhetoric about heroic civilian defenders, looked at potential agents with undisguised pragmatism. Internal documents recorded the fear that most of those who settled there are primarily interested in making money. This meant careful screening and generous remuneration. Recruiters appealed to patriotism and offered advance payments of up to $3,000 a year, which in 2014 prices amounted to almost $30,000. This amount was to double after the start of the invasion, according to one planning document. At least some of the recruits were fingerprinted, and all of them were secretly checked by the FBI for signs of disloyalty. In one case, the Bureau discovered a candidate's connection, a resident of Stony River, with a list of names in 1943 materials regarding Communist Party activities in Alaska. Names, addresses, professions, habits, connections, all of this was neatly recorded in memorandums with security classifications. One agent was described as a postmaster in Kiana, another as a hotel manager in Valdez.
One candidate worked for a tin mining company in Lost River on the Seward Peninsula. A declassified Air Force document paints a portrait of an ideal candidate with a meticulousness that is itself a historical document of the era. Professional photographer in Anchorage, he has only one hand, and it is believed he will be of no use to the enemy in any labor battalion. He is a radio amateur. He is a licensed hunting or fishing guide well acquainted with the art of survival. He is a pilot of a small airplane. He is sufficiently intelligent, particularly wily, and possesses sufficient physical courage, as indicated by his offer to lead a party that intended to hunt Kodiak bear armed only with a bow and arrow. A man with one hand who is ready to go after a bear with a bow. This is who American intelligence was looking for in Alaska in 1951. Cities with known agents included Anchorage, Fairbanks, Palmer, Big Delta, and Cordova, strategically important points on the map of a territory that the military viewed as a likely theater of operations. Now about secrecy, and about how far it went. The operation functioned in several parallel layers of closure simultaneously. The first, numerous code names: Stage, Washtub, Alaska Project, Corpuscle, Stigmatic, Catboat. The second, strict isolation of agents from each other. Each of them did not know the identities of the others, so that in the event of capture, the entire network would not be compromised.
The third, closed memorandums circulating exclusively within a strictly limited circle of officials.
One of the agents later recalled that his handler spoke with him exclusively in a car, the engine running, the radio turned on. Checking for bugs, he explained. In 1951, in Alaska. There was also a fourth layer of secrecy, perhaps the most indicative. Documents show that the newly created CIA was intentionally excluded from the planning process. A striking fact. The Central Intelligence Agency, a structure specifically created for coordinating American intelligence activity, was intentionally sidelined from one of the largest intelligence projects on American soil. The FBI and the Air Force zealously guarded their creation. An FBI memorandum from June 20th, 1950, recorded that the Interagency Intelligence Conference is considering a plan for training individuals who could act as U.S. agents in the event of an occupation of Alaska by a foreign power. But the CIA did not participate in this consideration. The irony is that the CIA eventually had to create its own station in Anchorage, initially intended as an office from which it was planned to drop spies into eastern Russia. The agency tried to involve Colonel Lawrence Kastner in its Alaska program, the creator of the legendary Alaska Combat Intelligence Platoon, known as Kastner's Cutthroats, which became famous in World War II. But the colonel passed away in 1949, before the Anchorage station became operational. Parallel structures, parallel plans, parallel secrets. Each agency was building its own Alaskan front, not fully knowing what its neighbor was doing. A former CIA technical director, upon learning about the disclosure of the operation in the press in 2014, said simply, "This was news to me." 60 years later, a man who had worked his whole life in American intelligence heard for the first time about what was happening right under his nose. Individual aspects of Operation Washtub circulated in closed military and intelligence circles for months, if not years, before the start of implementation. But the full picture, with all its code names, classified memorandums, one-armed agents, and caches with gold coins in the frozen earth, remained invisible to everyone except the narrowest circle of the initiated. This was exactly how Hoover and Carroll intended it in early '51. Maximally invisible, maximally isolated, maximally ready for a war that, as they believed then, could begin at any moment. Imagine a person, say a postmaster from Kiana or a hotel manager from Valdez, who one day receives an unexpected invitation. He is not told exactly where or why. He is told only, "You need to come to Seattle." He leaves his business, gets on a plane, and finds himself in a city that, compared to the Alaskan wilderness, seems like another planet. There, a briefing awaits him, the content of which he will not tell his wife or his closest friend. Not then, not later. Not in 10 years, not in 30. The training of Operation Washtub agents was built around one key principle. None of them should know who else is participating in the program. They were prepared separately from each other, individually, as if each of the 89 were the only one. This was not a whim. It was a condition for the survival of the entire network. If one agent were captured and talked under pressure, he would not be able to betray the others, because he simply would not know their names. In a world where Soviet military doctrine provided for the elimination of local resistance in occupied territory, this precaution was not paranoia, but arithmetic. In Seattle, agents were taught coding and decoding messages, secret photography, methods of interrogation and recruitment of informants, skills for leading partisan forces in remote winter conditions. Plus cipher tables, surveillance, aerial drops, hand-to-hand combat, Soviet military uniforms and equipment. Each had to be able to distinguish a Soviet officer from a private, by insignia, by greatcoat, by equipment. Each had to be able to compose an encrypted report and transmit it so that interception would not lead to decryption. Survival in the winter Alaskan wilderness without outside help. However, most of them did not need to be taught this. They had been doing it all their lives. One agent spent 12 days in Washington in June-July 1951, undergoing specialized training, including parachute jumps. 12 days for a postmaster or fisherman, a man who had never had anything to do with the Army or Special Services. 12 days, after which he was to return home and live as if nothing had happened, knowing that in the event of an invasion, he would have to jump from a plane or coordinate the evacuation of downed pilots.
Declassified documents show that the average age of an agent was 50 years. One can imagine a 50-year-old hunter from the Alaskan wilderness, accustomed to a Winchester and a dog sled, sitting at a table and trying to master cipher tables. Judging by those same documents, this did not always go smoothly. These were not young adventurers, but mature men with established lives and established habits. That is exactly why they were valuable as agents, but that is exactly why part of the skills were difficult for them. However, cipher tables were only part of what awaited an agent after recruitment. The true material embodiment of Operation Washtub became the caches, dozens of hideouts scattered across the snowy expanses of Alaska. The program placed them in caves, remote cabins, buried them in the ground, hid them in distant forests, everywhere where a Soviet patrol would not think to look. Each cache cost approximately $2,500 to prepare and equip in 1951, the equivalent of approximately $29,000 in current prices. Inside these hideouts, tools for both survival and espionage were stored. An agent reaching a cache could find there a semi-automatic rifle of .30-06 caliber with a telescopic sight, a small caliber pistol with a silencer, 150 feet of climbing rope, mountain skis, snowshoes, radio equipment, explosives for destroying evidence, and $500 in gold or silver coins for trade. Separately, food supplies, winter gear. Gold coins, a detail that deserves separate attention. Planners proceeded from the assumption that under occupation, paper dollars would lose all meaning, while gold and silver would remain a universal currency. This was the calculation of people who thought about war very specifically, right down to the question of what to pay for food with when the familiar world collapsed. A rifle with an optical sight, a pistol with a silencer, explosives. All of this was stored in the frozen Alaskan earth, patiently waiting for a day that, as the planners believed, could come at any moment. Each such cache was a partisan's small arsenal, designed for a person who would remain alone, without communication with command, without reinforcements, without a way back. But behind the caches and ciphers stood concrete people, those who conceived the operation and those who agreed to participate in it. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was the driving force behind the entire plan, at least in its initial stage. He entered into a partnership with Joseph Carroll, his former protege who headed the newly created U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, to launch Operation Washtub in early 1951. Top-secret joint efforts turned OSI into the operator of the resident agent program. Hoover set the parameters, the ratio of agents to population, selection criteria, recruitment methods. Carroll provided the infrastructure on the Air Force side. Together, they created a mechanism that had not previously existed in American intelligence: large-scale recruitment of civilians as intelligence operatives on American soil. Among those who were presumably successfully recruited, one name stands apart: legendary Alaska bush pilot Bob Reeve, founder of Revolution Airways, was presumably among the 89 agents. His name is hidden in declassified documents. However, his job title is not hidden: CEO of Revolution Airways. Only one person, company founder Bob Reeve, ever held that position. The legendary aviator was about 50 years old at the time, and it is not known for certain whether he eventually became a resident agent. Reeve was born in 1902 in Wisconsin. In his youth, he enlisted in the Army at age 15 to fight in World War I. He was not taken, but was noted for his persistence. He then worked on merchant ships in China and the Soviet Union, an irony that could not fail to attract the attention of recruiters. Returning to his homeland, he first learned to fly on a Curtiss JN-4, and then took up transporting mail between Lima and Santiago. Not having quenched his wanderlust, Reeve illegally boarded a steamship headed for Alaska and arrived there in 1932. According to some accounts, at that time he had a suitcase, a can of sardines, and a vague idea of what to do next. Over the next 4 decades, he became one of the most famous bush pilots in Alaska history, a man better known as the Glacier Pilot. Bob Reeve was a pioneer of glacier piloting and proved that the airplane is the key to Alaska's future, Jimmy Doolittle said of him. Throughout his well-documented career, Bob Reeve never once hinted that he might have been recruited as part of secret anti-Soviet forces in Alaska, so says his son, Richard Reeve. But it is entirely possible, he adds.
His father was always very friendly with the security at Elmendorf Air Force Base. I wouldn't be surprised at all, Richard says. If Reeve did indeed participate in the project, then perhaps in the 1950s he gave a veiled hint at Operation Washtub. When someone asked him if Alaskans were afraid of the Russians, given that they could wave at each other across the Bering Strait, Reeve answered as only a man who knows something more than an ordinary citizen could answer. Like hell.
If we don't knock them down like pigeons before they get to the Alaska range, we Alaskans, each with half a dozen rifles and ammunition, will just kick their teeth in. His biographer, Beth Day, recorded these words, not knowing that behind them, perhaps, stood quite concrete knowledge of caches of rifles, gold, and radio stations hidden in the Alaskan wilderness. In addition to Reeve, documents established the identities of several other agents. Dayton Ab Gillard from Cooper Landing, a settlement on the Kenai Peninsula south of Anchorage, was a well-known bush pilot like Reeve. His fate was tragic. Gillard died in a plane crash on Montague Island in Prince William Sound in May 1955 at the age of 45. He did not live to see the invasion, nor the declassification, nor even the end of the operation itself. Guy Raymond, a person of a completely different mold. Documents describe him as a stout tin miner from Lost River with tattoos of a dagger and an eagle on his arms. Lost River, on the Seward Peninsula, was one of the priority areas for placing Washtub resident agents. Raymond worked for a tin mining company, one of those people whose presence in a remote corner of Alaska was absolutely natural and would not have caused the slightest suspicion among occupation authorities. Recruiters, by all appearances, appreciated not only his geographical position, but also the tattoos. A person of that appearance does not look like an agent of any intelligence service under any circumstances. Ira Weisner, from the gold mining town of Rampart, another name that surfaced from declassified papers. A gold miner, a man whose work and life were tied to the land of Alaska by the strongest possible bonds. All these people, pilots, miners, postmasters, hotel managers, were threads of a single network whose existence was unknown even to each other. But there was one group of people in Alaska who were consciously and unconditionally cut off from this network. The indigenous peoples of Alaska became the most striking exception among the potential agents. Native Alaskans, Eskimos, Indians, Aleuts, were people who knew this land better than anyone. For years, they had served exemplarily in the Alaska Territorial Guard and other armed forces. They were hunters, trackers, people for whom survival in Arctic conditions was not a skill, but a way of life. By all practical parameters, they were ideal candidates for partisans, but they were excluded from Operation Washtub. Declassified Air Force documents formulate it this way. Selection of agents from Eskimo, Indian, and Aleut groups in the territory should be avoided.